Kevin Ann, thank you very much for those inspiring comments and for helping all of us to realize, I think, two things. One, how proud we should be of Pearl S. Buck because she is part of that great Pulitzer tradition, extending now across a centennial, and how proud we should be as a conference to be a part of the Campfire Initiative and share that with the other states and the other efforts going on around the country. So you've placed both of those things in very nice context for us, and we appreciate that very much. And your comments also give me occasion to thank once again our friends at the West Virginia Humanities Council, represented by Mark Payne here. Without Mark, without the Humanities Council, without the Federation of State Humanities Councils working with the Pulitzer Board to create the Campfire Initiative, we would not be here today. So thanks again to our Humanities Council, one of West Virginia's jewels in the crown, for being a good partner on this event. And I need to offer one more set of thanks to my colleague who was monitoring the technology during Kevin Ann's presentation. You heard me say this morning, none of this would have been possible, literally or figuratively, without Lisa Martin, who is in the back corner of the room. I can say the same thing about so many projects we undertake and so much work we do in our office if it were not for my good colleague Amy Garbrick. So Amy, thank you. We are truly blessed to have Lisa and Amy and dedicated professionals like them throughout the university that make programs like this possible. So thank them both very much. And now I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. And again, I will encourage you to read his biography in the materials we presented to you when you registered. If you read that biography, it will tell you that Dr. Lau is the author of Pearl S. Buck, A Cultural Bridge Across the Pacific, and it will also tell you about his work as associate professor at the Defense Language Institute and the Middlebury Institute for International Studies in Monterey. It will tell you that he earned his PhD in English from West Virginia University in 1995, so it is a great source of pride for us to welcome you back, Professor Lau, as the keynote speaker for our conference. But what his bio won't tell you is how he came to WVU in the first place. And so my supplement to the written biography is the story of how Professor Lau came to WVU in the first place. In 1979, a decade before he became West Virginia's governor, a young insurance executive named Gaston Caperton led a delegation to China to learn about China's educational system. As part of his trip, Gaston visited Beijing Normal University, where he met a sophomore student named Kang Liao. The two began a friendship that exchanged books and written correspondence about a variety of topics. And after getting involved in China's pro-democracy movement in the late 1980s, Professor Lau came to the United States to attend a seminar at Yale University. He wrote to his friend, now Governor Caperton, and Governor Caperton, as many of you know, a tireless and effective ambassador for WVU and for the state of West Virginia, encouraged him to come to WVU for doctoral study. And while Gaston Caperton could not be here today, I want to thank him for connecting WVU with Kang Liao. It is a connection we renew and celebrate today with his keynote presentation on China's recent realization, the real peasant life portrayed by Pearl S. Buck. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming WVU alumnus, Professor Kang Liao.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ko, for the introduction. I wish I had done more to deserve this honor to be the keynote speaker. And I want to thank Gaston Caperton in his absence, who made this possible, because at that time I was only a sophomore. I don't know what he saw in me, but he kept correspondence with me and sent me books and encouraged me to learn English. And it was actually during that first meeting that I gained confidence that I could speak the language. He had a way to make people talk and feel free, and so I was very grateful. And when I came to Yale to attend the summer seminar, I didn't have any other friends, so I wrote a letter to him, and he replied to my letter right away. And I found under his name the new title, governor. What is a governor? I had read some British novels and knew what a governess was. But then my friend at Yale said, you know Gaston Caperton? The new governor who was going to put a computer in every high school classroom? Well, you don't need to worry a thing. So that's how I came here. Well, today I'm going to discuss what China has recently realized about Pearl Buck's literary achievement. When talking about her, many scholars said, Pearl Buck, an American. What did she know about China? And even Lu Xun, the greatest Chinese man of letters in the 20th century, assumed that she must have been superficial. And only Chinese writers understood China and could certainly write better books than The Good Earth about Chinese peasants. Well, it's many decades later that we realized, after a lot of studies have been conducted about Chinese peasants' life, that Pearl Buck was actually the first person who wrote about Chinese peasants' life. The first not only in America or in the West, but the first in the world. And we realized that actually she presented the Chinese life so realistically, and she wrote about the relationship between Chinese peasants and the landlords more truthfully than the Chinese writers did. And also, we realized how important it is to see the truth and present it in literature after we learned what disastrous consequences the lies had caused. Well, some scholars couldn't believe me when I said Pearl Buck was the first to write about Chinese peasants. But let us look at the history of China's literature. Just like traditional European literature before the 19th century, China's is also about the royalties and aristocrats, as well as scholars and outlaws. Look at this list. Classical Chinese poems are short and mainly about emotions and ideas. There are very few long narrative poems and no epics. Stories and novels are about strange happenings, state affairs, life of the noble men and women, not ordinary life, certainly none about peasants. Their life was boring, so the writers thought. Lu Xun was the first important author of essays and stories about ordinary people, but he didn't write a novel. And even in his famous stories, The True Story of RQ and The New Year's Sacrifice, the protagonists are not peasants, but a village lout who does some odd jobs from time to time, and a nanny and a domestic helper. Then came Pearl Buck's most famous novel, The Good Earth, published in 1931. We all know it was a very popular and influential novel about Chinese peasants' life, but I can't claim its influence on the ensuing novels by the Chinese writers about the life in the countryside, because they had their national pride and they wouldn't admit it. But more importantly, these novels are very different from The Good Earth. Mao Dun's Countryside Trilogy, Wang Tongzhao's Mountain Rain, and Xiaojun's Village in August are the predecessors of the proletarian revolutionary literature, which I'm going to expound later. Xiao Hong's stories of the Hulan River are typical local color writings, and their literary value is much greater than the other three books put together, I would say. But unfortunately, the writer died too young. By the way, she was also a woman writer, and her style was soon replaced by that of the revolutionary literature. The so-called proletarian revolutionary literature developed under the guidance of Mao's talks at the Yan'an Forum on Literature and Art, delivered and published in 1942. These talks influenced China's literature in the 20th century more than anything else, and the influence, though dwindled, can still be felt today if it's not reviving. The main point of the talks is, although art and literature have their own characteristics and must follow their own rules in their development, they are, after all, political tools of the revolutionary cause, which was to fight against imperialism and the exploiting class. Art and literature must serve the masses, the workers and the peasants, and educate them as well as the artists themselves. Mao's talks were thus the manifesto of the proletarian revolutionary arts and the literature that particularly encouraged the writing of peasants, for peasants, and even by peasants. Under Mao's guidance, artists and writers went to villages to experience what peasants' life was like and to gather materials for their artistic and literary creations, which was a good thing, except they stayed there for only a few months or a couple of years at the longest. Certainly not like Pearl Buck, who lived among the peasants for decades, talking about her works being superficial. What is worse about the works of the revolutionary artists and the writers is that they were the tools to serve a political cause, and therefore they had to be politically corrected and perfected. Take the collectively created opera The White-Haired Girl, for example. The original true story is that a country girl who worked in the landlord's house as the domestic helper was seduced by the landlord, who would not marry her. She could not bear the shame, ran away, and lived in the mountain alone for years. And her hair turned gray for lack of salt and sunshine. And she was thought to be a ghost because she was spotted several times when she went to steal the offerings in the local temple at night. When the communists came, she was saved. To emphasize the class hatred and the struggle, the storyline was improved like this. The girl's father owes the landlord some money and can't pay him back. The landlord presses him so hard that he commits suicide. He sells his daughter to the landlord as a bondmaid and then commits suicide. The landlord rapes her and makes her pregnant, and the girl runs away and keeps herself alive by hatred and determination for revenge. She once scares the landlord half to death in the temple and eventually avenges herself and her father when the communist army liberates the village. Musically, the opera is a harmonious combination of Western opera and the Chinese national music and folk sounds. And the opera was an instant success, and in order to make it more revolutionary, it underwent some further revisions under the guidance of Mao's talks. For instance, the girl was not sold to the landlord, but taken away by force, and her father fights the landlord to death. Her hope to marry the landlord was cut out, and later another character was created, the girl's fiancé, who gives the landlord a good beating, escapes to join the Red Army, and eventually returns to the village to lead the fight against the landlord class. The opera became the most popular theatrical product in the communist areas of China. The audience appreciation was much more than artistic catharsis. They were incited to fight the landlords in their villages. Some bourgeois intellectuals wrote articles to describe the revolutionary baptism they experienced seeing the opera and the awakening to class consciousness the opera brought about. If the opera only praised the communist new society and awakened the audience class consciousness, Zhou Libo's Storm and Ding Ling's The Sun Shines Upon the Sangan River taught readers and the communist leaders how to incite peasants' hatred for landlords and how to carry out the class struggle in the country. These two novels are the best of China's proletarian revolutionary literature, and the latter also won the Stalin Prize for Literature in 1951 for its revolutionary value and functions. The novel Storm is a literary illustration of the revolutionary policy and the method of the Chinese Communist Party during the land storm movement, demonstrating how the peasants are made to realize that the landlord exploits them, to awaken to the so-called truth that the landlord class is their enemy, and only by overthrowing it can they ever live a decent life. The peasants' hatred for the landlord is incited, and they are mobilized and organized to fight the enemy. The revolutionary storm breaks down the old productive relationship that has existed for thousands of years. The peasants gain the courage and take the landlord's property and divide the land among them. The landlord is beaten up, conquered, and killed. The novel is full of violence and a violent language, and worst of all, such violence is justified by the class struggle theory in the novel. Similarly, The Sun Shines Upon the Sangan River also celebrates the revolutionary violence and describes the relationship of people in the country as nothing but class oppression by the landlord and the struggles against him by the peasants. The landlord in the novel lets his son join the communist army in order to protect his class interest. And he makes his daughter marry a communist army, a communist leader, in order to marry a communist leader in order to corrupt the key leader of the new power. And he also encourages his niece to have an affair with a peasant leader in order to set up a sex trap. And the peasants in the novel are taught by the communists to rise against the landlord. Everyone is shown as the tool of class struggle, and the peasants' victory in the struggle is shown as the sole drive of historic progress and agricultural productivity. Hatred, cruel revenge, and even killing are demonstrated, rationalized, and even hallowed as the indispensable sacrificial ritual of the revolution that will supposedly improve most people's lives. These novels, among many others, are not without a certain artistic achievement. Like the opera, they vividly portray some peasants, farmers, and landlords, poignantly describe their psychological activities as well as their daily lives, and successfully use the language in speech representation along with the writer's own language for narration. However, the authors all used class struggle as the key in these novels, aimed at serving the proletarian politics, and they made their novels literally the revolutionary manuals for other communists to follow in the land reform. These novels became models of China's proletarian literature for later writers to imitate. As a result, at least 1 million landlords and rich farmers were physically eliminated, and many more were persecuted or reduced to utter destitution, and even their children were made to pay for their parents' debts and to suffer for their parents' crimes. I mentioned China's land reform several times, and you may wonder what it was and how it was conducted. Well, it was the single most important reason that the Chinese Communist Party led by Mao defeated the Nationalist Party under Chiang Kai-shek. Many people wondered how the Chinese Communist Army, with weapons no better than rifles, could defeat the Nationalist Army equipped and financed by the United States, and with captured and surrendered weaponry and ammunition from the Japanese troops at the end of World War II. A Taiwan student once told me that it was because the communist soldiers forced the nationalist captives to charge at the very front, and their brothers, of course, would not shoot at them. Well, that's probably the nationalist authorities told her in school. Some say it was because the Communist Army had a great general, Lin Biao. That makes better sense, and Lin Biao was indeed an invincible military strategist, one of the best in China's history. But we all know better. A war is never won by one man. If we had to choose one man for the Chinese communist victory, it had to be Mao, who found the right way. The right way is not always the moral way. In fact, it's more often than not the amoral way, as discussed in The Prince by Machiavelli. In this case, it was land reform, as Mao stated on the United Government in 1945. The land reform started in 1946, 3 years before the People's Republic of China was founded. It was conducted in the communist areas of China, mainly in the north, and it won the party millions of supporters among the poor and the middle peasantry. How come? Because the land and other property of landlords were expropriated and redistributed so that each household in the rural village would have a comparable holding. This communist practice seemingly embodied the Confucian ideas of 均富, equal wealth, and 不患贫,患不均, do not worry about poverty, worry about unequal distribution of wealth. These ideas are epitomized by the slogan 耕者有其田. Those who plow the field should have their own land. And it has been the dream of a perfect world that China has endeavored to realize for more than 2,000 years. The point is how. In China, it is often by violence. Throughout 2,000 years since these ideas were raised, in every peasants' uprising, the rebels used this slogan, grabbed the land from the rich and gave it to the poor. Thus, they won the support of the poor, who were many, and defeated the rich, who were few. What the communists did was no exception, as they acknowledged it themselves. Okay. The making and implementation of the outlines of China's land law of 1947 abolished the feudal land system in the liberated northern areas of 160 million people, providing the liberation war with political, economic, and military resources. Without the victory of the land reform, the triumph over Chiang Kai-shek would not have been possible. And so the land reform has an important historic significance. The agrarian revolution was made infamous in the West by William Hinter's book, 翻身, which can be translated to stand up. But don't just listen to what a Westerner said about the land reform. Ren Bishi, a member of the Chinese Communist Party's Central Committee, also stated in a 1948 speech that 30 million landlords and rich farmers would have to be destroyed. Mao insisted that the people themselves, not the security organs, should become involved in the killing of landlords who had oppressed them. This was quite different from Soviet practice, in which the counter-revolutionaries were arrested and executed and often buried before sunrise. Mao thought that peasants who killed landlords with their own hands would become permanently linked to the revolutionary process in a way that passive spectators could never be. Actual members killed in the land reform are believed to rank in the millions, as there was a policy to select at least one landlord, and usually several, in virtually every village for public execution. In 1976, the United States Department estimated that there may have been 1 million killed in the land reform. Mao himself estimated that only 800,000 landlords were killed. Yes, he used the word only. What was a landlord? What was a rich farmer? By the communist definition, a landlord was a farmer who had enough land to live on and did not have to work the field but hired hands to work for him or lent usury to him. A rich farmer was one who had land and worked the field but also rented his land to peasants and lent usury too. To become landlords or rich farmers was most peasants' dreams. They might be jealous of landlords and the rich farmers, but they found nothing wrong in being them. There was a little so-called class hatred or class struggle. Therefore, in the land reform, the major task of the communist work team was to make peasants understand that landlords and the rich farmers preyed on them and exploited them. They helped peasants recall and understand the crimes of landlords and the rich farmers. They incited class hatred toward the landlords and the rich farmers, mobilized and organized peasants to fight landlords and the rich farmers, to take their land and the property, and even to eliminate them if they were not subdued. Such fights were described in novels like Zhou Lipo's Storm and Ding Ling's The Sun Shines Upon the Sangang River. There is nothing wrong to describe the struggle and the process of the land reform realistically, but the problem is the attitudes of the authors of those literary works. They justified the cruel class struggle and taught many communists how it should be conducted. They not only served the communist propaganda in the land reform, but also set vivid examples how to do it for some areas and for the second wave of the land reform from the mid-1950s from mid-1950 to the end of 1952, all over China. We can see the formula in these novels. First, they describe the exploitations and oppressions by landlords and the rich farmers. Second, they incite hatred between peasants, rich farmers, and the landlords. Third, they educate peasants and mobilize them in the struggle for their liberation. Fourth, they show the struggle as part of the proletarian revolution in the whole country and even part of the international anti-imperialism campaign. And fifth, the communists expropriate the land and property of the landlords and the rich farmers and redistribute them among peasants. Sixth, then the fights between the classes follow and always end with the peasants' triumph. This is how the East was won. And the proletarian revolution literature played an indispensable role in the victory. Well, the violation of sanctity of private property and the democide of at least 1 million landlords and the rich farmers were the original crimes of the communists. However, such injustice committed in the land reform was justified by the communist propaganda machine, as well as the Chinese literature from the 50s to the 70s. I don't want to bore you with the contents of these novels, but suffice it to say that they again and again take class struggle as the theme, portray peasants and the landlords as class enemies, advocate and glorify violence against the class enemy in the name of revolution. These novels do not lack charms, but their charms did more harm than Plato and Confucius ever feared literature could do to society and human beings. 2 generations were affected by the proletarian revolutionary literature since Mao published his talks in 1942. The Chinese readers were enchanted by the description of the poor peasants' sufferings and by the portrayal of the hateful class enemies, and by the exciting class struggle in those novels. Their class hatred was stirred and directed to the landlords and later to intellectuals. Most of them were the landlords' descendants. Their class love was aroused and directed to the Communist Party and their leaders, and eventually to Mao alone. Humanism was replaced by the theory of class struggle, against which everyone and everything was measured. Spouses condemned each other, children exposed their parents' counter-revolutionary crimes, communists fought communists, and young students sacrificed their lives by trying to save a few desks and chairs from fire or flood because they were the property of the proletarian state. But no one would save a drowning man because he might be a counter-revolutionary criminal committing suicide. Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative was rightfully disobeyed in China during the Cultural Revolution. It's not really hard to see how all this could happen. The logic chain is actually quite clear. Private property is evil, and the more property one has, the more evil one is. And so his property must be taken away and redistributed to others. Now he is less evil, but everyone else is a little more evil than before. Therefore, in the perfect world, all property must be taken away by the state, and we all work together happily for the common good. The trouble is, there are always some people in charge of distributing property in the state. The new class enemy is bound to emerge, even among the communists themselves. Therefore, continuous revolution is a necessity. As Mao put it, a revolution must be made every 7 or 8 years. After the Cultural Revolution, in which not only Chinese intellectuals, but almost all communist leaders were persecuted by turns, Chinese people awakened to the impossibility of communism and to the harm of the class struggle theory. We realized that the vicious circle of the continuous fights began with the wrong presupposition that private property is evil. Under Deng Xiaoping's influence, the communique of the Third Plenum of the Eighth Party Congress stated in 1979 that large-scale turbulent class struggle of mass character have in the main come to an end. Deng flatly ruled out the possibility that a new exploiting class could emerge under the socialist mode of production. They realized that private property is good. Private property must be held in awe and protected by law. The communist leaders and their children quickly redistributed the state property among them and happily became the new capitalists and the landlord, except they don't call them that. Okay. And but that's another story. What concerns us more is that we began to challenge the literary theory which maintains, on the one hand, as Mao advocated, that art and literature must serve the proletarian revolutionary cause, and on the other hand, asserts that art and literature should even disregard truth, as Vladimir Nabokov expressed in the metaphor. The magic of art was in the shadow of the wolf that the boy deliberately invented, his dream of the wolf. Then the story of his tricks made a good story. We have seen that the damage of the dream of the wolf can be much greater than the loss of a few sheep. We know what terrible consequences could result from the tantalizing world created by the magic of artistic writers, if they were also political fanatics. We have realized that only in a free and democratic country can people afford to enjoy art for art's sake. But today's artists in China still have a solemn duty of describing life as it is. And so to learn a historical lesson, we still need to describe life as it was. What was life really like in the old society before the communists took power? What was the relationship between a landlord and the peasants? Did a peasant ever become rich under the landlord's oppression and exploitation? If so, how? Our Confucian scholars despised peasants, and no one found their life interesting enough to write about. Our communist writers distorted the relationship between a landlord and the peasants with the class struggle theory and political agenda. Some old people still remember, and what they told us we found strikingly similar to what we read in Pearl Buck's novels. The conflicts in The Good Earth, for example, are between man and nature, man and women, man and other men, and even among one's own family, as we see the own family members like Wang Long and his uncle. Individuals, not classes. The conflicts can be between a woman and other women, in one's heart and internally, mind and body, different desires. A landlord does not always remain rich, as Huang, who sells his land to Wang and gradually becomes poor, whereas Wang Long becomes rich through hard work and frugal living and with a little bit of luck. The relationship between the landlord and the tenants can be friendly, like that between Wang Long and the Qing. People from different classes are not necessarily enemies, but they may need one another and even love one another. The ruling class fight among themselves for power and dominance more ferociously than they oppress the working class, which they need to use rather than kill. Yeah, these are the conflicts we found in Pearl Buck's novels. Okay, so these truths are so simple, and you take them for granted here, but they were surprising to us who were brainwashed with the communist class struggle theory. We saw a completely different world in Pearl Buck's novels, a much more believable world of China's countryside and the peasant's life. After the Cultural Revolution, Chinese writers began to publish works that are different from the mainstream of the proletarian revolutionary literature, and their works have quickly become the mainstream. Their works echo, enrich, and reinforce Pearl Buck's portrayal of Chinese peasants and farmers. They all demonstrate much fewer and less severe class conflicts between peasants and the landlords or rich farmers. They all depict more conflicts between man and nature, peasants and the wars or political movements. They all reveal conflicts of the farmer's dreams, desires, jealousy, or greed. They show peasants' conflicts with the bureaucracy, regulations, and officials. They all illustrate conflicts between traditions and the new ideas. In a word, we find more and more similarities in post-cultural revolution Chinese literature about China's peasant's life to Pearl Buck's novels. Some of these writers, like Zhou Keqin and Chen Zhongshi, have gained national fame in China. One has won the most famous international prize, the Nobel Prize in Literature. And he is, of course, Mo Yan. I believe. Yeah, previously. Oh, okay. Later, yes, I'm sorry. And yet, I want to mention a writer that most people may have never heard of, Xie Baoyu, the last one, okay, who published only one novel, Rose Valley. But this book vividly shows the vicissitudes of a mountainous village in Sichuan province of China, and the novel portrays some vivid characters, and through their tragedies reveals the darkest hue of human hearts when the conditions allow evil to prevail. This novel is not widely accessible in mainland China yet, but I believe it will stand side by side with The Gulag Archipelago by Alexandra Solzhenitsyn. Except Rose Valley, there is, however, one obvious difference between all these realistic novels of much later Chinese writers and the Pearl Buck's novels about the Chinese peasant's life in the past, and that is a certain legendary color. After all, these writers only heard of or imagined the stories they wrote, but did not experience them. So we cherish Pearl Buck's realistic novels because she had been there, seen Chinese peasants' life, known their language, and had a way to write their stories artistically without any ideological prejudice or political purpose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have a few moments before we need to take our break and then get ready for our next concurrent session. So are there any questions for Kevin Ann or for Kang Lau?
Well, Jay, I was
Dave?
just wondering, with Pearl Buck being very anti-communist, and with all of your research into the communist writers and so forth, for example, The Three Daughters of Madame Wang was one with, she got information from China about the atrocities of the. How could Pearl Buck, after writing things like that are anti-communist, be, let's say, coming back into popularity in China?
Okay, did you hear his question?
No.
Yeah. Basically, he said that Pearl Buck was very anti-communism by writing books like The Three Daughters of Madame Liang and Letters from Beijing, and also, don't forget, Satan Never Sleeps, which was also made into a movie. And it's exactly because of these novels that he was hated by the communist leaders, plus some personal reasons as well. For example, she invited Wang Ying, a famous Chinese actress, to China instead of Jiang Qing, who later married Mao. Well, who married Mao. And the question is, since she was so anti-communism, how could she be accepted by China, welcomed by Chinese readers? Well, first of all, she wasn't. She was banned for more than 20 years, for more than 30 years, I would say. Yes, and it's after the Cultural Revolution in 1976 that we began to read him. Well, actually, it's even in the 1980s. Professor Yao may know that even better. That we rediscovered Pearl Buck. We began to publish his books, and we discovered that she actually wrote China more realistically than any other writers. And we also should thank a businessman who worked with China's travel agency. Not a businessman, but a government official, but he worked with a travel agency because he was an English major student, but he was involved in tourism. He met a lot of American visitors in Zhenjiang. He worked in Zhenjiang, and they all wanted to see Pearl Buck's residence. And so he said, who was Pearl Buck? So he began to study Pearl Buck, and then he saw the opportunity to develop tourism, and so they renovated Pearl Buck's residence, and it became a tourist attraction. And of course, Americans loved Pearl Buck, and China became America's best friend for a few years until recently when we had some conflicts over Nanhai. But anyway, today's China's communist leaders were already abandoned the class struggle theory, and they saw Pearl Buck as just a writer. Now it's much more moderate than before. It's the Central Committee of the party still control literature, but it's much more relaxed than before. So, her books were translated and published in China. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you very much.
We have a question over here.
I'd like to thank you, give you a compliment, because you paralleled for us here what Pearl Buck did in her Nobel acceptance speech. She shared with that community and that world what Chinese literature was. You just shared with us the Chinese literature. It's a great bookend in my mind. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, my pleasure. When I was preparing for this speech, I was thinking, you all know Pearl Buck a lot. I don't want to carry code to Newcastle, so to speak. But I'd like to mention the background and the Chinese literature, and so that we can see the importance of her realistic portrayal of Chinese peasants' life.
Any other questions? I will say one more thing to Kevin Ann as she was talking, and I was remiss in not mentioning this earlier, but West Virginia has 2 Pulitzer Prize winners in the 2015 cycle. One is an alumna of WVU, Margie Mason, who was part of the team from AP that wrote the story about the use of slave labor to benefit the seafood industry. And then a Marshall University alumnus, John Hackworth, received, I think, the prize for editorial writing. So a WVU graduate, a Marshall graduate, 2 West Virginians, both on the slate of Pulitzer Prize winners the same year. So another reason why we're delighted to have you here and be able to celebrate the Pulitzer Prize. A lot of state pride in that award.
And other West Virginians have won in previous years.
Yes. And we hope to continue to send you good nominees and to have additional winners in the future. Yes?
This is for Kevin Ann. I don't know if this is a silly question or not, but does each winner get a medal, or do they only get a certificate? Do you know?
Sure. The question was, does each winner of the Pulitzer get a medal or a certificate, or how is the award manifested?
The award is a small medal, very elegant. It's not even a medal. It's, what do you call the plastic? Not plastic, clear, and it's an obelisk. Yeah, somebody's saying it. Lucite, like it's a very nice, small, elegant. It's much smaller than you would expect. And then there's a $10,000 award that goes with it. Interestingly, the Public Service Award, which is the gold medal, does not carry the $10,000 award. It is the gold medal by itself.
So each one gets gold.
Yeah. Each one gets the lucite-like obelisk, and the winners in the other categories also get the prize money.
Are the checks signed, example Pearl Buck's signature, available in research or in archives? I've always wondered what it looked like.
Oh, that's interesting. I don't know. I've never been asked that question. So in other words, the check made out to her for having, first of all, it probably wasn't $10,000 then. It was probably a different sum. But I don't know the answer. We can find out. We could easily ask in the Pulitzer.org. Yep.
Any other questions for either of our speakers? Well, then please join me again in thanking them both for being wonderful.